There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the clamor of the world begins to drown out the whispers of truth within. At such times, we may feel compelled to act, to fix, to chase, to solve. But what if I told you that the most powerful thing you could do now is nothing? Yes, do nothing. Stop striving, stop analyzing, stop manipulating your fate like a marionette in your trembling hands, not because you are giving up, but because something deeper, something wiser is preparing to awaken. In the stillness your psyche breathes, in the silence the soul reorganizes itself. When you stop interfering with the currents of your life, you allow the deeper order to emerge, one that was never born from logic, but from meaning. There exists within the human psyche a profound tendency toward balance, a kind of inner symmetry that strives not for perfection, but for wholeness. This tendency, often obscured by the constant motion of modern life, becomes visible only in stillness. In moments of quiet, when the distractions fade and the external world loosens its grip, the psyche begins to realign itself. This is not an abstract or mystical notion. It is an observable psychological process that unfolds when the ego steps aside and the deeper layers of consciousness are allowed to come forward. The psyche, by its very nature, is self-regulating. Like a compass returning to true north, it seeks equilibrium. However, when a person lives entirely in action, responding to every stimulus, striving constantly for achievement, solving every perceived problem with immediate effort, the psyche is thrown out of balance. The inner world, full of symbols, instincts, emotions, and unspoken truths, is ignored. In this imbalance, symptoms arise: anxiety, fatigue, confusion, and disconnection. These are not simply problems to be solved through doing more. They are signals, urgent messages from the unconscious that call for attention, reflection, and stillness. Stillness does not mean apathy. It is not passive resignation, nor is it the absence of life. Rather, stillness is a dynamic space where the conscious mind ceases its interference and opens to the guidance of the deeper self. It is a state in which the inner world can be heard. Through stillness, the tensions and oppositions within the psyche between reason and feeling, will and instinct, persona and shadow, and begin to communicate with one another. In this communication, new energy is born. It is the energy of integration. When we become still, we begin to see the contents of our inner life more clearly. Thoughts arise, yes, but so do images, memories, and intuitions. Feelings long buried begin to surface, not to harm us, but to be understood and reconciled. These rising contents are often the very ones we avoided through busyness and distraction, yet they carry the keys to our healing. The psyche does not present us with arbitrary noise in stillness. It brings forth exactly what needs to be seen. This process is intelligent, organic, and oriented toward wholeness. The healing that emerges in stillness is not linear or logical. It follows the rhythm of the unconscious, which often communicates in symbols, dreams, and unexpected insights. One may sit in silence and suddenly recall a moment from childhood, not for nostalgic indulgence, but because that moment contains unresolved energy that needs to be acknowledged and integrated. Or one may feel a deep sadness arise, not as a weakness, but as a truth long held at bay, a part of the self that must be welcomed home. These are not interruptions to life. They asterisk our asterisk life, moving toward wholeness. The culture teaches us that value lies in productivity, in action, in external achievement. But the psyche knows that true value lies in balance. When we are constantly doing, constantly striving, we move away from our center. Stillness is the movement back inward. It is an act of faith in the natural intelligence of the soul. It says, I trust that I do not need to control everything. I trust that something within me knows the way forward. This trust is not naive, it is born from deep psychological insight. The psyche has its own form of wisdom, a teleological pull toward becoming what we are meant to become. This process cannot be forced. It can only be supported, and the way to support it is often by doing less, not more, by resting in presence, by allowing space for the unconscious to do its work. In stillness, one also begins to recognize the archetypal patterns at play in one's life. The eternal dramas of the human soul, the hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the search for meaning, begin to appear not as abstract myths, but as personal experiences. These patterns are not imposed from the outside. They arise from the deep structure of the psyche. And when we are quiet enough, when we stop acting and start listening, we begin to understand which archetypal energies are moving within us. This understanding brings coherence. It brings peace. Furthermore, stillness reintroduces us to the forgotten language of the soul, the language of images, metaphors, intuitions, and sensations. In the silence, the inner life becomes articulate. What could not be said in words before now finds expression in a dream, a sudden realization, or an emotional release. These expressions are not random, they are purposeful. They are the psyche's attempt to restore balance. Of course, stillness can be uncomfortable at first. The ego fears losing control. The mind resists silence because it fears what may be revealed. Yet it is precisely in facing this discomfort that transformation begins. When we learn to sit with what arises, to hold it without judgment, we invite the psyche to reorganize itself, not according to our limited will, but according to the deeper principle of individuation, the unfolding of the self in its fullest, most authentic form. To engage in stillness is to enter into dialogue with the soul. It is to step back from the surface level noise and tune into the subtle movements of the inner world. It is a return to the center. And in this return, the psyche does what it is designed to do. It heals, integrates, balances, and reveals. Thus, doing nothing is not the absence of progress. It is the condition that makes true progress possible. For only in stillness does the soul reveal its direction. Only in stillness does the psyche begin to remember its natural rhythm, and only in stillness can everything fall quietly, patiently, and precisely into place. There is a hidden aspect within each of us, a figure that follows us wherever we go, though we rarely turn to face it directly. This hidden side, known as the shadow, is composed of all that we repress, deny, or cannot accept about ourselves. It includes not only the so-called negative traits like anger, envy, fear, and selfishness, but also the disowned potential, our passion, creativity, power, and even love. The shadow is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a part of our own nature seeking recognition and integration. And it is in silence, in the absence of distractions, that this shadow begins to emerge. In the stillness of inner observation, the unseen reveals itself. What was hidden behind the noise of daily life becomes perceptible when we stop running from ourselves. The emergence of the shadow is a natural and necessary process for psychological growth, yet it is not something that can be forced through effort or analysis. It arises when we are quiet enough to hear what has long been pushed aside. In silence, we withdraw our energy from the outer world and redirect it inward. As the external stimuli fade, the internal voices grow louder, not in volume but in presence. At first, these voices may seem uncomfortable or unfamiliar. They may whisper truths we have long denied, revealing thoughts, feelings, or impulses we wish we didn't have. But this discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something long buried is coming into awareness. The silence creates a space where defense mechanisms can no longer operate at full strength. Our usual strategies for avoiding inner conflict, distraction, rationalization, projection, lose their grip. In this psychological openness, the shadow begins to stir. It may appear in the form of a memory that provokes shame, or a sudden wave of anger we thought we had outgrown. It may come as a critical inner voice, as resistance to sitting still, or as an irrational fear. These experiences are often interpreted as negative or regressive, but they are in fact signs that deeper layers of the self are becoming accessible. The shadow is not evil, it is simply that which is unconscious. And what is unconscious can only become conscious through attention and acceptance. In silence, we begin to recognize that the parts of ourselves we rejected did not disappear. They went underground. They continue to influence our behavior from the depths, shaping our perceptions, reactions, and relationships. The more we deny them, the more power they gain in the unconscious, but when we face them directly, their power diminishes. We no longer need to project our inner conflicts onto others. We can begin to own our anger instead of blaming others for provoking it. We can feel our sadness without collapsing into despair. We can acknowledge our desire without being enslaved by it. Silence does not remove these aspects. It brings them into the light where they can be worked with consciously. This confrontation with the shadow is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process that deepens over time. Each layer of silence reveals a new layer of truth. As we continue to observe ourselves without judgment, we begin to discern patterns in our emotional life. We may notice how often we seek approval to mask our insecurity, or how our need to control others stems from a fear of vulnerability. These realizations do not arise from moralizing or self-criticism, they arise from honest witnessing. The shadow emerges in silence not to condemn us, but to complete us. Its emergence is a call to wholeness. It is in the act of witnessing without interference that healing begins. The psyche does not require punishment, it requires understanding. When we stop resisting what arises in silence, we send a message to the unconscious, I am ready to know myself. And the unconscious responds by offering its contents, not all at once, but gradually in the rhythm of the soul. The images that arise, the moods that shift, the dreams that deepen, these are the signs that the shadow is communicating. It may speak in symbols through a recurring dream figure or a sudden inspiration. It may come in bodily sensations or unexpected emotions. Our task is not to interpret everything immediately, but to remain open, curious, and grounded in our awareness. This kind of inner work requires courage. Facing the shadow means confronting parts of ourselves that we have judged as unacceptable. It means seeing how we have harmed others and ourselves, not with guilt, but with responsibility. Yet the reward is immense. Each piece of the shadow that is integrated brings energy, authenticity, and depth. The very qualities we feared often become our greatest strengths. The anger we denied becomes the fire of conviction. The sadness we avoided becomes compassion. The envy we suppressed becomes motivation for our own development. Silence, therefore, is not empty. It is filled with the presence of the unconscious. It is the doorway through which the shadow enters our awareness. But it does not come to destroy, it comes to be seen, heard, and healed. This process does not require dramatic rituals or external validation. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to sit with what is, to meet ourselves as we truly are, without masks or pretense. And it is through this meeting that transformation begins. The shadow does not dissolve by being fought. It is integrated by being embraced, and this embrace begins in silence, not the silence of suppression, but the silence of listening. The silence that honors the complexity of the human soul, the silence that makes space for contradiction, ambiguity, and mystery. In this sacred silence, the shadow no longer needs to hide. It steps forward, tentative at first, then stronger, until it stands beside us not as an enemy, but as a companion, a bearer of lost parts of ourself, a guide to a deeper, more whole way of being. And in that companionship, we begin to understand that what we thought was darkness was, all along, the beginning of light. There is a moment in every life when the old structures begin to dissolve. Roles, identities, ambitions, even belief systems lose their vitality. The familiar routines no longer offer meaning, and what once seemed certain now feels hollow. This is not a failure of character, nor a collapse to be avoided. It is the threshold of something profound. In the quiet spaces left behind by this dissolution, individuation begins. It does not emerge from abundance or clarity, but from emptiness. And it is precisely in this emptiness that the self starts to take shape, not the self that society has constructed, or the one molded by familial expectations, but the deeper, authentic self waiting to be known. Emptiness is often misunderstood. To the untrained mind it appears as a void, a blankness, a space without purpose. It provokes anxiety because we are conditioned to fill every silence, to solve every pause, to avoid the discomfort of the unknown. Yet the psyche, in its wisdom, uses emptiness as a crucible. In this space where the ego no longer dominates, something more essential can emerge. The emptiness is not truly empty. It is pregnant with potential. It is a clearing in the dense forest of personality, a place where light can reach what was previously concealed. Individuation, the process by which a person becomes whole, is not a project of addition, but of realization. It does not consist in adding virtues or achievements, but in uncovering what is already there, hidden beneath the debris of adaptation and persona. And this uncovering begins when the surface loses its grip. The silence and stillness of emptiness allow the unconscious to make itself known. Images arise, dreams shift, intuition grows sharper. These signals, subtle and often ambiguous, carry the threads of the true self. They do not offer instant clarity, but they invite participation. One must listen, reflect, and remain open. In the emptiness, the ego, accustomed to asserting control, feels threatened. It wants direction, certainty, and action. But the journey of individuation cannot be controlled. It can only be followed. The emptiness teaches the ego to let go, to release its tight grip on identity and narrative. What remains is not a blank slate, but a raw, open terrain where the inner voice can finally be heard. That voice is not always pleasant. Sometimes it speaks in riddles, sometimes in pain, but it is real and it is ours. It leads not to conformity, but to authenticity. The process of individuation demands a descent. One must move downward, inward, and through. The emptiness provides the space for this descent. In the absence of distraction, the psyche turns toward its depths. What is found there is not always light. Often it is the shadow, the repressed, the unlived. But this confrontation is necessary. Without it there can be no wholeness. The shadow must be met not with judgment, but with curiosity. Why did we banish these parts of ourselves? What were we protecting? What have we lost in doing so? These questions arise naturally in the emptiness, where there is room for truth to surface without being drowned in noise. As the contents of the unconscious emerge, something astonishing begins to occur. A new sense of order arises, not imposed from outside, but discovered within. Patterns that once seemed chaotic begin to make sense. Conflicts that once felt irreconcilable begin to find resolution. This is not because the outer world has changed, but because the inner world is coming into alignment. The self is taking shape not as an ideal, but as a living, dynamic center. This center does not reject the world, it includes it. But it does so on its own terms. Emptiness also teaches the difference between solitude and isolation. In the beginning, the two may feel alike. The loss of roles, the dissolution of external structures, can create a sense of loneliness. Yet solitude is the soil in which individuation grows. In solitude, we begin to encounter ourselves not as functions or labels, but as beings. We begin to discern the contours of our own soul, the shape of our own longing. This discernment is not possible when we are constantly surrounded by noise, expectation, or performance. It is only in the quiet emptiness of being alone that we begin to recognize who we are beneath the masks. This emptiness is not static. It is a process, a rhythm, a movement. It does not simply strip away, it reveals. The longer we stay with it, the more it offers. We begin to notice subtle desires not for more things, but for meaning, connection, expression. We begin to remember dreams we had forgotten, instincts we had silenced. These are not fantasies, they are messages from the self, invitations to reclaim what was abandoned. The emptiness has made room for these messages. It has prepared us to receive them. The journey of individuation is long. It does not follow a linear path. It spirals, returns, deepens. There are periods of clarity and periods of darkness. But in each phase, emptiness plays a role. It is the recurring space where transformation occurs. It reminds us that growth is not about accumulation, but about refinement, that becoming oneself is not a performance, but a surrender. Through emptiness, we come to see that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. The self is not an object to be created, but a reality to be discovered. This discovery does not require constant action, but receptive awareness. It asks that we step back, wait, and trust. Trust that the psyche knows its path. Trust that the unconscious carries wisdom. Trust that what appears as emptiness is, in fact, the beginning of becoming whole. To begin individuation is to accept the emptiness not as failure, but as invitation. It is to recognize that what feels like loss may actually be the shedding of what no longer belongs. It is to enter the space between stories and there to listen for the voice that has been speaking all along, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily from the depths. This voice does not shout over the noise of life. It waits for silence, and when the silence comes, it speaks. To let go is to release the tight grip of control that the ego exerts in its endless attempts to secure certainty, identity, and significance. It is not a passive act, nor is it an act of despair. It is a conscious surrender to a greater psychological truth, that much of the suffering we endure is not caused by external events, but by our resistance to them. Letting go is the act of ceasing to struggle against what is, and in doing so, we open the way for the restoration of inner order. This restoration is not achieved by force or will, but by allowing the natural intelligence of the psyche to reorganize itself once the interference of egoic control has subsided. In the attempt to maintain a sense of control, the ego often clings to ideas, images, memories, grievances, and plans for the future. It builds identities around wounds and dreams alike, holding on to both as if they were essential to survival. But the deeper psyche is not static. It is a living process, always moving toward balance, meaning, and wholeness. When the ego refuses to release its grip, the psyche cannot move freely. The result is inner conflict, fragmentation, and a loss of vitality. Letting go, then, becomes not a failure to act, but a necessary participation in the psyche's own desire for equilibrium. This process often begins when the structures we relied upon begin to fail. A relationship ends, a career path collapses, a belief system no longer holds weight. These moments of rupture are often seen as crises, but they are also invitations. They force us to confront the illusion of control. They reveal the places where we have over-identified with roles or narratives that no longer serve our growth. And in the wake of this realization, letting go becomes both a necessity and a possibility. It is the turning inward, the relinquishing of the external props that once gave us a sense of self, and the humble acceptance of what remains. Letting go does not mean erasing the past or denying emotion. It means releasing the compulsive attachment to how things should have been, how others should behave, or how we should feel. It means allowing emotions to rise and fall without suppressing them or becoming identified with them. Anger, grief, disappointment, these are all part of the natural response to loss or change. But when we hold on to them indefinitely, when we rehearse our grievances or fixate on what was lost, we block the psyche's natural movement toward integration. Letting go clears the space needed for that movement to resume. As we begin to let go, we may experience disorientation. The structures we once relied on to define ourselves are no longer there. This emptiness, however, is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the beginning of a new order forming within. The psyche, like nature, abhors a vacuum, but it fills that space not with noise or distraction, but with meaning. When we stop filling the inner world with demands, judgments, and attachments, we make room for insight, for healing, and for a reorganization of our inner life that reflects deeper truths. This inner order does not arise according to the plans of the ego. It emerges organically from the unconscious, often through dreams, symbols, and sudden shifts in perspective. It is not linear or predictable. At times it may seem chaotic or uncertain, but beneath the surface something essential is taking shape. We begin to feel more aligned, less fragmented. We notice that our reactions change, that old patterns lose their grip, that we are no longer ruled by fear or compulsion. This is not the result of effort, but of release. The energy once used to maintain control is now available for renewal. Letting go also requires trust, trust in the deeper intelligence of the psyche, trust in the unfolding process of life, and trust in the self that exists beyond egoic constructs. This trust is not blind. It is grounded in experience, in the recognition that our attempts to force outcomes often bring suffering, while our moments of surrender often bring clarity. When we stop trying to dictate the course of our lives and instead listen inwardly, we discover that we are guided not by logic alone, but by a deeper knowing that cannot be rationalized, but can be felt. This knowing arises in the quiet, in the stillness that follows release. There is also a moral dimension to letting go. When we release our attachments to being right, to winning, to being seen a certain way, we make room for humility and compassion. We recognize that others are also caught in their own struggles for control, identity, and meaning. We become less reactive, more forgiving, more capable of seeing the humanity in others. Letting go softens the ego's sharp edges. It allows us to relate not from defense or pride, but from presence and understanding. In this state of openness, we begin to respond rather than react. Our choices come not from fear or compulsion, but from alignment with our inner truth. We act not to prove or protect, but to express what is real in us. This is the fruit of inner order, a way of being that is both grounded and fluid, centered yet open. We become more congruent, more authentic, more whole. Letting go is not a one-time act, but a continual process. Each day brings new opportunities to release what no longer serves us. An old resentment, a rigid belief, a false self-image. Each act of release is an affirmation of trust, a gesture of faith in the deeper wisdom of the psyche. And with each release, the inner world becomes more coherent, more peaceful, more capable of holding the fullness of life. The paradox is clear: in letting go we gain, in releasing control we find clarity. In surrendering identity we uncover essence. What seems like loss becomes the doorway to freedom. What feels like emptiness becomes the space in which the soul can speak. And through this process, order is not imposed from the outside, but restored from within. The psyche, finally unburdened, can return to its natural rhythm, an inner harmony that moves us toward authenticity, meaning, and wholeness. In a world that equates movement with progress and productivity with worth, non-action is often mistaken for passivity, laziness, or evasion. But there exists a deeper dimension to not acting, one that does not emerge from avoidance, but from profound presence. Non-action, when practiced with awareness, becomes a sacred form of attention. It is not the absence of doing, but the fullness of being. It is the rare and powerful decision to stop interfering with the unfolding of experience, and to witness, without grasping or judging, the movements of both the inner and outer worlds. In this way, non-action is not inaction. It is a kind of reverence for life as it is, without imposition. There is a state in which the psyche, having exhausted its habitual efforts to control, to fix, or to interpret, falls into a deep and watchful stillness. In that stillness, something extraordinary occurs. One becomes aware of awareness itself. Thought may still arise, but it is not followed. Emotion may pass through, but it is not analyzed or resisted. The senses remain open, yet the mind does not cling to any impression. This is non-action in its truest sense, a receptive stillness, an inner posture that allows reality to speak for itself. The sacredness of this mode of being lies in the quality of attention it brings to bear. It is not the distracted attention of the ego scanning for advantage or confirmation. It is not the anxious attention of fear or desire. It is pure attention, untainted by motive. It neither reaches for nor recoils from what it sees. It simply witnesses. This kind of attention has power, not the power to dominate, but the power to illuminate. In its gaze, what was hidden begins to reveal itself, not through force, but through presence. Non-action is particularly potent in moments of inner conflict or emotional turbulence. The conditioned response is to react, either to suppress the discomfort or to act impulsively in hopes of relief. But non-action teaches a different way. When one does not flee from the discomfort, but holds it in awareness without judgment, the energy of that discomfort begins to shift. The psyche, unpressured by intervention, begins to process and reorganize itself from within. This inner movement cannot be directed by will, but it can be allowed, and allowing is the heart of non-action. This practice is not easy. It goes against the grain of egoic programming. The ego thrives on activity, on agenda, on narrative. It is deeply threatened by silence, by stillness, by not knowing. Yet it is precisely in these qualities that the soul begins to speak. The soul does not shout above the noise of ambition and anxiety. It whispers in the quiet. To practice non-action is to make room for that whisper, to clear a space in the psyche where the deeper voice can be heard. There is also a profound humility in non-action. It acknowledges that we do not always know what to do, and that often doing nothing is wiser than doing something from fear, pride, or confusion. This humility is not weakness, it is clarity. It recognizes the limits of egoic knowledge and defers to a larger intelligence. That intelligence is not abstract or external. It is woven into the fabric of the unconscious, into dreams, instincts, and the mysterious timing of insight. When we stop trying to push the river, we discover that it has been flowing all along, and that we are carried within its current. In relationships, too, non-action reveals its sacred nature. When conflict arises, the impulse to defend, attack, or explain is often overwhelming. But when one resists the urge to react and instead holds the other, and oneself in silent, open presence, something shifts. The dynamic de-escalates, space opens, genuine communication becomes possible. This is not manipulation, it is the deep respect that comes from recognizing that understanding cannot be forced, presence cannot be faked, and healing cannot be rushed. Non-action also teaches us to see more clearly. In the absence of immediate response, the deeper patterns of thought and emotion become visible. We begin to notice the stories we tell ourselves, the assumptions we carry, the judgments we make without awareness. And in noticing them, we are no longer ruled by them. Awareness itself becomes the agent of change. What was unconscious becomes conscious, not because we sort it out, but because we stopped running from it. In this way, non-action becomes the gateway to insight. There is a rhythm to life that cannot be captured by linear planning or constant striving. Seeds do not grow by being tugged upward. They grow in silence, in darkness, in stillness. The same is true for the deeper movements of the soul. The most profound transformations often occur not when we are actively trying to change, but when we have stopped interfering with the process. Non-action is the soil in which inner change takes root. It allows space for the new to emerge without being forced into premature form. In spiritual traditions across cultures, there are echoes of this wisdom. The Taoist concept of *Wu Y*, the mystical Christian practice of contemplation, the Buddhist emphasis on mindfulness, all recognize the power of presence without interference. What they describe is not passivity, but alignment. A way of being that allows us to participate in life without losing ourselves in it. A state where action arises naturally from clarity rather than compulsion. Ultimately, non-action reveals that we are not separate from the processes we observe. We are not outside of life trying to manage it. We are within it, inseparable from it. When we cease to impose our will upon every moment, we discover that life has its own intelligence, and that our deepest wisdom arises not from thinking, but from listening. In this sacred attention, we are not the doer. We are the witness, the vessel, the participant in a mystery that cannot be grasped, but can be honored. To live from this place is to know a different kind of freedom. Not the freedom of endless choice or control, but the freedom of alignment with what is real. Non-action does not deny the world. It meets it with open eyes and a quiet heart. It listens, it waits, and in its waiting, it sees what action, if any, is truly needed. This is the sacred nature of non-action, a path not of absence, but of presence, not of withdrawal, but of depth, not of passivity, but of profound participation in the unfolding of being.